Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so we are nearly at the finish line. I think today is probably going to be the class that we're going to spend the most time on, looking at the different amendments and addenda. Some of them we've already talked about, but we're going to review them again as we go through. So last week we finished with paragraph 3, which is really where all the negotiating is. Now we're going to get into paragraph 4 is going to list all of the forms that may be attached. And then starting with paragraph 5 will be the explanations of the paragraphs, the sections in paragraph 3 where the negotiating was done. So with that said, I am going to share my screen and we will jump right into it. All right. So what you guys should be looking at right now is the paragraph 4 of the RPA. So here's the addenda, advisories, and then anything else that is connected to it, right? So the first thing that we look at here, it says property type addenda. This agreement is subject to the terms contained in the addenda checked below. So the first one we talked about a couple weeks ago is the Tenant Occupied Property Addendum. And what that Tenant Occupied Property Addendum does, we could open that one up right now. We're going to add it. What the Tenant Occupied Property Addendum does is it dictates the terms of this sale based on having tenants in the property. Now, the thing that I think is the most misunderstood about the TOPA, the TOPA, is that people think you're only supposed to use it if the tenant is remaining in possession, and that's not true. Even if the tenant is going to be vacating the unit, we have to incorporate this, right? Not just for those, not just for the tenants that are remaining in possession. So this has to be included. It's really important, and that's not just for units, it's for single family. It's any property that has a tenant in it. We have to make sure that we're filling this out. So remember that this is right now is an addendum to the purchase agreement, because as the buyer's agent writing it, we're incorporating it into our offer. So if it were part of the counteroffer, then that's where we would put it, as part of the counteroffer, right? Because let's say as seller, I need to make sure it's incorporated, right? I need to make sure that that's incorporated so that we're covering all of the terms of the tenant occupied property. So first, tenants remain in possession is the default. The tenants are going to remain in possession of the property. Okay. If the property is going to be delivered vacant, then we're going to check this box 1B, that the property is going to be delivered vacant. There's all kinds of things that can go along with this that we can negotiate, right? Is it all the entire property, right? So if it's 2 units and you don't put anything in for the units that are going to be vacant, then you're stating that the entire property is going to be vacant. So keep that in mind when you're selling a property with units. Now, what I will say is you have to be careful that you can even vacate these tenants. So the conversation, I just had a conversation this week with an agent that said that they were told by the listing agent that the unit was going to be delivered vacant, and that's how they were writing the offer. Even if the listing agent, the seller, everybody is telling you that this property is going to be delivered vacant, you have to be careful, because in the entire state of California, we're not just talking about the cities that have their own rent stabilization ordinances. We're talking about all of California. You have to have cause to evict the tenant. Okay? So that could be that the tenant is violating their rental agreement, meaning either they're not paying the rent, they're doing something that violates the agreement, like have people that live there that aren't on the rental agreement, they're running business out of their rental. Any of those things could be a legitimate reason for starting the eviction process on a tenant. The only other ways that we truly have cause as landlords to evict tenants, and we're talking about in units, we're not talking about in single family in most places, and I'll mention that in a moment. I think this is just a good refresher for the tenant stuff because it just needs to be kind of in rotation because not everybody gets to hear it, so hopefully more people get to hear this. So when it comes to units, the only other way, if they're not violating their rental agreement, is I'm going to move into my unit, right? I'm the owner. I own 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, and I've decided I want to live in one of my units. That's my right. I can evict the tenant for that. Now, when I do that eviction, because I want to live in it, I have to pay a relocation fee. And again, I'm not talking about cities with rent stabilization ordinances. I'm talking about just in general in the state of California. And in the state of California, that is 1 month's rent that I have to pay them in relocation. Okay? I can move in a family member. Now that family member has to be direct, has to be, son, daughter, mother, father that I'm moving into the unit. It can't be your cousin, your nephew, your uncle. Okay. Then it's the same thing. I can evict the tenant. I can pay the relocation fee. I can move my direct family member into that unit. Third is if I want to put a manager, right? So I have a 4-unit apartment building or plus, and I want my manager to live in one of those units. I can evict the tenant, pay the relocation, my manager can move in. The last one is, there's 2 more. I'm going to remove the property from the rent roll period. I'm never going to rent this property ever again. Then I could evict everybody in the units, pay the relocation fee, and never rent the properties again. Lastly, I am going to do so much renovation on the property, right? Permitted renovation on the property that it will be unlivable for an extended period of time. Then I can evict the tenant and pay them the relocation. That's it. Those are your only reasons. So if you're trying to sell a property as agents, and I just want to stress this, please do not try to encourage your sellers to start an eviction process to make the property more marketable or more desirable. Because what we're doing by doing that is we're, number one, giving them poor advice. Number two, putting them in a position that could get super costly for trying to evict the tenant when they don't have the right to evict the tenant. It's a problem. Now, when we start looking at the rent stabilization ordinance cities that exist in the state of California, there's a whole different set of much more stringent laws that stop you from being able to evict a tenant. And the cost of evicting the tenant are 10, 20, and 100 times more than what we're talking about for the state of California. Now, unincorporated county of Los Angeles. So if you have any kind of rental in an unincorporated part of LA County, right? It's not a city. It's just run by the county. Single family residences are covered by these tenant protection acts. And there is no limit to the amount of relocation that a tenant can ask for in those unincorporated LA County areas with the Tenant Protection Act. So you have to be super careful. And we found out by accident. We didn't know that. And it was our fault that we didn't know that this ordinance was in place on single families. Now, we assumed, like everywhere else in California, that it was in place on units, but this was also in place on single family. The tenants, by the time this whole thing started and they had agreed to sell, that it was going to be vacant at close of escrow, the sellers were elderly couple. They gave the notice to vacate to the tenants of this single family home. They right away invoked their rights that they had, which is their right to do. and they requested that the seller pay them $50,000 to move out of the house. And then on top of that ridiculous request of $50,000, they ended up suing this elderly couple for, I believe, $500,000 for illegal eviction attempt. So it became messy. I think it ended up getting all straightened out, and that got handled. In that case, I could still evict the tenant, and the proper eviction on the tenant, when it's cause in that county, it did have some caps on what the amount of the relocation fee was. This one was just, there was no cap because it was a no cause eviction. So you just have to be really careful in the advice that we give to our sellers and buyers, because on the flip side, from a buyer, if I'm not careful in the verbiage in my offers or in my counter offers or anything else, and I agree that this property is going to be vacant at close of escrow, right? Even though we know that realistically the chances are it is not. I have to build some protections in for my buyer, because if I don't do it properly and we're saying, hey, we accept saying that maybe the seller says, well, that's fine, but the buyer is I'm not going to start the eviction process till the buyer removes all contingencies, which first of all, I advise you guys to do as a listing agent if you're going to get that. Like, let's just take the rules out. And as a single family residence that's for sale and has tenants, and you're going to evict the tenants, which you can in most of the state of California, then my counter is going to be, well, we're not going to start the eviction process until you remove all your contingencies. I want to make sure you're committed to the sale. I'm not going to have a vacant house and then all of a sudden you're going to say, I changed my mind and walk away. So let's forget that. But if you get a counter from a seller that says, okay, so we're not going to evict the tenant until you remove your contingencies, and buyer agrees to extend escrow as necessary for us to complete the eviction process, you've just agreed that you're stuck into that process. Right? So that means that if you give up, if you get tired of waiting the 3, 6, 9 months, like some escrows that we've had here have gone, because they agreed to vacate tenants and that's what it took to negotiate and find the right price and the tenant to find a place to go and actually decide to move instead of just planting their feet and staying, you could be in a position where your buyer doesn't have a choice but to maybe put their deposit at risk if they can't continue to wait. So what we do as buyer's agent is, let's say that we get that counter from the listing agent that says the seller does agree to vacate the tenant. The eviction process will begin once buyer has removed all contingencies, and buyer agrees to extend escrow as necessary for us to complete the eviction, which is perfectly fine. That's normal. But from the flip side, for buyer who I need to protect, I'm going to then, in my counter offer back to the listing agent, I'm going to state, buyer will agree to extend as necessary, or a buyer will agree to extend an additional 30 days or 45 days from original close of escrow date. If seller can't complete eviction by that time, then seller agrees to allow buyer to cancel and release full deposit to the buyer. So that even though I may have removed my contingencies, if they can't perform in a reasonable amount of time, I have the protection for my buyer to be able to back out and get their deposit back. Because nothing's going to be worse than having a buyer that's sitting in escrow for 6 months, can't close, and then a seller tries to keep their deposit. That relationship you have with that buyer is not going to be great after that. Alba, you had a question, so let me go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Alba.
Good morning, Kyle. Thank you for taking my answer. What if we, as a selling agent, advised the seller, everything that you just said, and they still went ahead and hired an attorney, to try to vacate the tenants? What do we do there?
Well, I mean, you can only advise them so much, right? I mean, we don't have mind control over them, unfortunately, but if you give them the proper advice and say, hey, in the state of California, it's 99.9% impossible to evict a tenant in units. In single family, there's a little bit more, leeway. and you give them the advice that we just talked about. You explain to them the process. You talk to them about what we need to do in order to do it. And they still say, nah, we don't care. We're going to do it. We can do it. We talk to the tenant. That's what always happens is they'll say, oh, no, we've already discussed it with the tenant. And the tenant's good with it. They're going to move anyway. So we're negotiating. And then inevitably what happens is the tenant says, I can't find a place to go and I'm not moving.
Right.
If they do that then and say, no, thank you for the advice, but we're going to go, we have an attorney that says we can do it, then I would follow up with an email that says, hey, by the way, I just want to follow up on our conversation. I did advise you of the difficulty of evicting the tenants and what it could mean for the process of our escrow. You've chosen to find an attorney to start that eviction process. And I just want to make sure that that's clear that this is the way we're going to move forward, right? Like I put it, this is what we have to start doing too. And I know I've talked about this a lot. We've got to start putting some stuff back on our client. There's so many times where we make the decision for them, which is a mistake, and then we pay the price for it. Or we talk to them and let them make the decision, but we don't memorialize it in a way where they don't forget it, right? Because buyers and sellers all get amnesia. When things don't go their way, they forget the conversations that were had. So as long as we're doing our job and then following it up, just so there's just a little bit of proof that that conversation was had, then you're good. You're fine.
Got it.
Right? So it's just make sure you're protecting yourself. If they do something to harm themselves, you can't always save them.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so let's keep going. If seller, after exercise of good faith, attempts and subject to applicable, is unable to remove the existing tenants by close of escrow or 5 days prior, I would always check 5 days prior. Buyer may cancel his agreement, and buyer's sole remedy shall be to return of deposit, and buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under this agreement, which total amount shall be no more than. Right. So what we're saying is that not only are you going to give me a deposit back, but you're going to pay me my some of my fees. All of my fees, like my appraisal, my inspection, or if you give me an additional $500, if I'm a listing agent, I'm going to counter back at a lower amount probably that we're going to refund them or nothing. I still want to put in my counteroffer this verbiage only because I don't think that listing agents or buyer's agents explain this document. They just give it to their client and say, you have to sign this because there's a tenant. So even though it may have some stuff in there, I always want to kind of reference back in my counteroffer. So there's two places where somebody can't say, I didn't know. I didn't know I had to pay this. I didn't know that this was what the rules were. I didn't know this is what happened if I couldn't evict the tenants. So I get it. Sometimes it's a little overkill, but with this tenant stuff, it has to be, because we've seen far too many issues where buyers and sellers have agreed to evict tenants and ultimately they can't. So too many lawsuits, too many issues where we've seen it. So I want you guys to take this super seriously with how we handle these tenant things, and make sure that if you're writing an offer, this TOP is included and it's filled out properly. Okay. If seller is able to remove existing tenants prior to close of escrow, seller, as applicable, shall disclose to buyer when the property became vacant, whether the tenant vacated voluntarily, and if so, whether seller paid the tenant to leave, whether seller filed a lawsuit, the unlawful detainer, to attempt to evict the tenant, if so, whether the lawsuit ended in a judgment. Seller, within 5 days prior to close of escrow, shall deliver to buyer the names of all adult occupants residing in the property other than the seller that are known to the seller, or the following are the names of all adult occupants other than the seller that are known to the seller. So you could give them a list, or you could put right in here on the TOPA, here's all the occupants' names. Even if pursuant to agreement, seller remains in possession after close of escrow, no tenants shall remain except, and then you put who's in there. So what has to happen is, if somebody lives in the property, if there's an adult that lives in the property that is not on title, you have to consider them a tenant. In this case, it's something. So we just had an issue where a husband and wife are getting divorced. Wife is not on title, but wife is the only one that resides in the property. Wife can't move until she gets the proceeds from the sale of the house. Agent is double ending the deal. buyer and seller. What do you do? Right? Because the woman can't move until she gets her money. She can't get her money till the escrow closes, but technically she's not a seller. So how do you negotiate that? Well, I could put on here that it's tenant occupied property. I can put her name in, that she's going to remain in possession because technically she is. Okay. And then I put her name down here because she's not the seller. And I say that this tenant is going to remain in possession. Now, I can do an amendment of existing agreement terms after, where I put something in writing where the ex-wife says, yes, I'm going to stay for 3 weeks. I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars for the 3 weeks, and then I will move out in 3 weeks. Because we don't want to put the lease agreement in place and take the chance of giving her tenant rights. In this case specifically, I feel comfortable that the woman is going to leave. That's not an issue. But you still have to address it. Can you imagine if, as an agent, you're representing both sides, buyer and seller, and you're kind of just blowing off the responsibility of what happens with this woman who is technically an occupant of the property and would be considered a tenant because she's not an owner, even though she's not paying rent. But you don't address somehow to protect your buyers. How are your buyers going to feel when they close escrow and for some reason this woman says, you know what, I have nowhere to go. I'm not moving. I can't move out. And they have to start an eviction process and they have to do all kinds of things to get her out because she doesn't have anywhere else to go. How are they going to feel about you? And then ultimately, who's going to be responsible because you didn't have the foresight to make arrangements to kind of make everybody unhappy, right? Because we all know that that's what negotiating is that everybody's got to walk away a little unhappy, right? I can't get everything I want as the woman that's residing in the property, unfortunately. And as buyer, I can't get everything I want, her out at the close of escrow. So we've got to make an attempt to put something together. We can't just put our heads in the sand and think, oh, it'll go away. Because the chances are that woman's going to remain in possession anyway. Whether we have something in writing or we don't, she can't move. So she's going to be there. Might as well take care of it now instead of having to deal with the problem later. Does that make sense? Okay. So if the buyer is the tenant, because that happens a lot, then we're going to check this off and put the information for the units. This is for the tenants that are remaining in possession. It's about what the seller's going to transfer, all the deposits and any unearned rent. Government compliance, so they're going to have to, anything that they've done based on restrictions, you're going to provide a copy of. The proposed changes, seller, if the seller has already made given a notice to a tenant to change some stuff, you got to give everything to the buyer. Any of the personal property that may stay there and remain with the sale, because let's say, for example, like, you know, we've seen videos now on the new state assembly bill that in January that landlords are going to have to provide the stove and the refrigerator. That becomes the seller's personal property. It's not the tenant's. So I have to put that list of what's included in the sale. Any service agreements that I might have, any income and expense statements, if that box is checked. The tenant estoppels, I'm going to tell you guys, as a everyday practice with these TOPAs, you should be asking for the estoppel certificates. The estoppel certificates are just a verification from the tenant that the information that was disclosed to me as buyer from the seller is the same as what the tenant is disclosing. Okay? So any of these things, they need to provide to you for the tenants that are remaining in possession. Buyer signs, seller signs it. Buyer signs it, seller signs it. It's included. Okay. This rent cap and just cause addendum is an explanation of what I just talked about for the state of California for those rent rules on how much you can raise rent and how you can evict and all of those things. Okay. In this case, it comes with the TOPA. And I think this becomes the most confusing part of the TOPA for most of the agents that have to use it. Is it says tenant signature and housing provider signature. This is not something that needs to be signed as part of this transaction. This more is an advisory of these are what the rules are, and this is something that when you are owner, you should have signed by your tenants. Okay, so it doesn't need to be signed for this transaction. Just want to make that clear for everybody because I've had that question a few times. Okay, so any questions about the tenant occupied property addendum, tenants issues, to any of that stuff? Anybody have any questions? Okay, all right, then let's go back to paragraph 4. I wish it would just stay on the paragraph. I feel like I'm making you guys dizzy. Okay, so the probate purchase addendum, the manufactured home purchase addendum, the tenancy and common purchase addendum, they're all basically the same form. They're just specific to that type of sale. So we'll just, for now, we're going to look at one of them, and we'll look at the probate purchase addendum, and we can add that in. And the probate purchase agreement. So top of it looks just like the RPA, right? The property address, the buyer's names, the seller's names. The property is part of a probate decedent's estate or a conservatorship, guardianship, or receivership. So those are different things, but they all get treated the same way as a probate, right? A conservatorship is somebody's hasn't passed, but they're incapacitated in some way, or they can't handle their own affairs. So someone has been assigned to take care of them. That's conservatorship, same as a guardianship. And a receivership is like we've taken it in because of a bankruptcy, they owe money, those kind of things. So that we're going to use this for any of those types of sales. If the property is being sold as part of a decedent's estate, paragraph 3A applies unless 3B is checked. So we'll get to that in a second. If the property is being sold through conservatorship, guardianship, or receivership, then court confirmation is required and the sale shall proceed under paragraph 3B. Okay. If the type of probate is incorrectly identified in paragraph 1A, seller shall inform buyer of the correct type of probate sale no later than the time for seller's disclosures in this agreement. So they gave them a time period. It's like, hey, this probate addendum was wrong. As long as you tell them by the time it's time for disclosures, you're cool. So court confirmation. 3A is court confirmation is undetermined at time of offer. Seller shall deliver written notice to buyer at time of acceptance or within the time seller delivery of documents in the time period paragraph in the agreement if court confirmation is or is not required. So if you don't know when you write the offer, then you would check one of those boxes in A1, 3A1. If court confirmation is not required, then you would leave it alone as part of 2. If court confirmation is not initially required, notice of terms of sale to beneficiary heirs is still necessary. If any beneficiary heirs object, then court confirmation shall be required. Seller shall promptly deliver written notice to buyer once seller has notice of any objection by beneficiary or heir. If after this offer is made, seller notifies buyer that court confirmation is required or court confirmation becomes required as a result of the objection to terms of the seller beneficiary, then buyer within 3 days after delivery of seller notices may cancel this agreement and shall be entitled to return of any deposit paid. So it's not like you just get stuck into the court confirmation process. If that's the case, then you get to cancel. Okay? If court confirmation is or becomes required and buyer has not canceled pursuant to 3A3, then the sale shall proceed under paragraph 3B. Obtaining a court confirmation hearing date within 60 days after acceptance is a contingency of the agreement in favor of buyer. So you can add that in. You could say, hey, if there is a court confirmation, right, I give you this amount of time to get the hearing date. Otherwise, if you guys can't get your hearing date in that period of time, then I get the right to cancel. Or if you already know that court confirmation is required, you check off the box in B. The sale is contingent upon court confirmation, which is a court hearing that allows for open competitive bidding for the property. The minimum overbid price shall be an amount equal to the accepted purchase price plus 5% of that amount plus $500. The court shall determine any further incremental overbidding amounts. See paragraph 4 for terms of court confirmation of sale. If the box is checked, obtaining a court confirmation hearing date within 60 days after acceptance is contingency of the agreement in favor of the buyer. So, court confirmation. When there is one required, there is an overbid process for all court confirmations. And here is the formula for it. So if it's a $500,000 sales price, they're going to add 5%, which is $25,000. So now it's 525 plus 500. So the first overbid amount is $525,500. Okay, so we know that number. If I want to go to court on the date of the hearing for the court confirmation as an investor that wants to overbid on it, I look at it and say, starting bid of 525, 500 seems like still a deal on this property. I'm going to give it a shot. So that's the first overbid amount. I need to show up with cashier's checks totaling 10% of that overbid amount, $525,500. Everybody that does that gets a chance to overbid. But before you do that, you have to go to the court before it starts, find the attorney for this property, show them the checks as your pre-qual, right? The cashier check for that amount as the pre-qual, and then they will put you on the list for the people allowed to overbid. It's not like you just walk in with the checks and when they say who's here to overbid, you raise your hand and stand up. No, you have to pre-qualify first with the attorney. The attorney has to give a list. Once that happens, then the court determines what the amount of the next overbid has to be, what the increments are. They decide that, and I don't know what that is. So if somebody were to overbid your buyer, so if you have a court confirmation, I suggest that you go with your buyers to that court date. They don't have to take the checks. But if someone comes to overbid, they've also got to be part of that bidding process, because they have to be able to bid the next increment if they want to get the property. And if they keep the property, then you'll adjust the purchase agreement that existed, that was accepted, that started the whole court confirmation process. If they get outbid by somebody else, then what happens is your offer is not accepted any longer. It is canceled. They now go and negotiate with this new buyer, and that new buyer gets the property. That's how it works. So when there is court confirmation, you got to make sure that you and your buyer are there. And it even says right here, when court confirmation is required, seller shall file a petition to confirm the sale of the property with the court. Seller shall notify buyer in writing of the court confirmation hearing date, time, and location at least 15 days prior to the court confirmation hearing date. Broker strongly recommends that buyer personally appear at the court confirmation hearing to protect buyer's position in the event of overbidding. So you got to do that. I don't know if any of you guys that are on here have been part of a probate that needs court confirmation, but it is essential that your buyer is there, especially if you're working with a sales price where you think that it's an attractive enough price that somebody would want to overbid. Now, in the prices of homes right now and what things are happening, that probably not a lot of overbidding happening, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And it would be a real shame if we were a little nonchalant with our clients and said, don't worry about the probate. People aren't going to overbid on that amount, and they don't go, and it does happen. That could be pretty disappointing, and not the best advice to give your clients. So keep in mind that could happen. Seller may remove the property. We're not going to go through all those paragraphs. Seller may remove the property from the court calendar if buyer has not removed all contingencies or only these contingencies checked below at least 10 days prior to the court confirmation hearing date. No, local probate court rules may require that all contingencies be removed before a petition or for confirmation can be filed. So keep that in mind too. If there's a court confirmation, you're going to have to go through all of your stuff. You may have to have everything done. You may have to have your appraisal done. You may have to remove your contingencies for all of those inspections, for loan, for everything else before you get that court confirmation date. Okay. Now, if you lose out in an overbid, they're not going to keep your deposit or anything. Okay. You have to give them preliminary what your vesting is going to be for the sale, for the purchase. If there's any other terms, I don't know what other terms we would put in there. And I don't know what site it's trying to leave. Oh, timed out on here. Buyer signs, seller signs. That's it. The commission in event of overbid. This is for the brokers. by another broker. The buyer's broker identified in the agreement agrees to waive all commission rights in the event of a successful overbid in court by different buyer represented by another broker. Meaning, look, if your buyer is committed to pay you a commission, I know the BRBC says that if the deal cancels or whatever, that you could still, like a listing agreement, you could still kind of try to collect on commissions. Can do that if they get overbid. Okay, seller's broker and buyer's broker agree that each will be paid according to the terms of the compensation agreement that each has with their own principal, and as may be modified by terms of the confirmed purchase agreement. So here's the thing with probates is they limit the total of value of the commissions to 5%. Okay, only 5%. So for example, if like the listing agent got a listing agreement signed for 5%, and that's the max of the probate, and the buyer's agent wants to come in and as asking for commission, and even if the administrator says, yeah, sure, we'll pay you 2% or 2.5%, the court was going to disallow anything over 5%. So then the buyer's agent now becomes responsible. So maybe on a court confirmation sale, a conversation with the listing agent on, commission amounts. Most listing agents are good, and they're probably going to tell you, hey, we can only pay you 1%, or we can only pay you 2, 1.5, or whatever the number is, because they know what the cap is. But just have a conversation with them, when you submit it. We've had plenty of times where when you get the notice of proposed action, because that's what they talk about in the file, that commissions get changed, and there's disputes on, hey, wait a minute, you agreed to pay me X amount of commission, and it doesn't get paid, and now it's saying, well, you got to cut your commission too. So be very specific. If I'm a listing agent and you ultimately have a probate that's court confirmation, and you've gotten a high commission, like a 3 or 4% commission, and you get offers that say 2.5%, when you counter them back, you've got to state something like total commission to be allowed by court is 5%. If the combination of listing agent and buyer's agent's commission exceed the 5%, buyer's agent's compensation to be reduced to the allowed amount, not both commissions, or something very specific about that. Can listing agent request 3% and have the buyer's agents get 2%? You can negotiate everything. If you know already it's going to be 5%. And there's still times in the proposed action where they'll reduce it more than the 5%, depending on what the court has to pay in fees and things like that. So keep that in mind too. You've got to address it that, hey, I'm going to get my compensation. If you don't get the full compensation we agreed upon because the court reduces the amount of compensation, you guys are, as buyer's agents, are going to take the hit, and you'll have to get your compensation paid for by your buyer. I mean, that's only fair. If you're the listing agent, I think that you could do that. But if you already know that they're going to allow the 5, then sure, go ahead, right? Tell them you're getting 2. The court will determine the commission amount. Whether buyer's offer is confirmed, overbid, or buyer submits a bid which is confirmed, the court approving the sale of the property will determine the compensation to be paid to seller's broker and buyer's broker. Commissions awarded vary from county to county. Commissions are payable by seller only if the sale closes. Seller is not liable for any commission to any broker or associate licensee who is directly or indirectly a purchaser of the property or has interest in the purchaser, which means if you write an offer and you are the agent, they don't have to pay you compensation, right? Like if your corporation is the one buying it, or you're personally buying it and representing yourself, they're not going to pay you the compensation. Okay. Questions about that probate. Now, what this does is it just makes a change. I'm going to show you again real quick the manufactured home. I'm going to show you it. We're not going to go into the detail of it because I want to try to keep moving. But as you can see, what it does is it just adds some specific information about the manufactured home, right? Manufactured or mobile home, that's what they call it, the manufactured home. And the tenants in common, that addendum we're not going to go through because the chances of you guys having to deal with one of those is not very high. The tenancy in common purchase addendum. Same with the stock cooperative. Now the mixed use one is probably something that is likely for you guys to come across. Okay, so the mixed use properties, that means it's commercial and residential together. The following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated and made part of the purchase agreement, right? The purchase agreement, the address, the buyer's names, everybody. So now we're going to describe the mixed use. How many are residential units, how many are commercial units, and what the commercial unit and space is used for. The possession of the commercial units, except as specified in 2B, tenant occupied commercial units shall be delivered subject to tenant rights upon notice of recordation of close of escrow. If you check B, currently occupied commercial units to be delivered vacant, right? Maybe the business is leaving. Vacant commercial units shall be delivered vacant upon recordation of close of escrow. Seller occupied units shall be delivered on close of escrow upon notice of recordation. These are additional financing terms. What items are included. Additional allocation of costs that aren't addressed in the RPA. Installation of safety features that may be necessary in a commercial deal that aren't in the RPA, so those terms aren't talking about. Any additional disclosures that may not have been referenced in the RPA but may be required because there's commercial property involved, and all those disclosures. So just make sure that if you are doing mixed use, you're incorporating that mixed use into the purchase agreement. All right, let's go back to, man, I don't want to, I'm going to make you guys get seasick watching me spin the pages. All right, next up. Other addenda. This agreement is subject to the terms contained in the addenda checked below. So if I have addendum number 1 checked off, that's because I needed to add space. That's the only reason that there would be an addendum number 1 attached to the RPA, is because we needed space that didn't fit somewhere else. This is the backup offer addendum. And if there is a backup offer addendum, this is what we use. If we're writing an offer knowing we're going to be a backup, I could check the box and add it. Otherwise, a backup offer addendum is probably going to come in the form of a counteroffer. But the thing is that this backup offer addendum does not get used nearly enough. So if I'm a buyer's agent and I have a conversation with the listing agent that says, yes, we're accepting backup offers, then I'm going to include this backup offer addendum. You have to, because what happens is this, just like we talked about last week with subject to interior inspection, where the miscommunication or the misconception of subject to interior inspection is, I get an offer that's subject to, I make arrangements for them to see the property, and then I accept the offer, which is not correct. If I get an offer that's subject to, I have to present the offer, accept the offer, and then schedule their inspection, their interior inspection, to decide if they want to move forward with the transaction. If they don't, they could cancel. In this case with backup offers, we kind of do the same thing when we're listing agents and buyer's agents, and we just accept that verbal, hey, you're a backup, right? So for a buyer's agent, the danger in that is that, of course, we get that phone call from the listing agent, and the listing agent says, hey, do you want to be a backup offer? And we go to our client says, hey, do you want to be a backup offer? And they say, yes, absolutely, right? Because they're not finding a place or whatever. They're excited by the fact that if this one doesn't go through, I have a chance at it, and I loved it. And then, let's be honest, for most of us that have gotten that phone call that this is that you're going to be a backup, we're going to keep you as a backup, very rarely do we ever even hear from them again that they're a backup offer, that, hey, our offer canceled, and that's it. And then even if we do, they call us and say, hey, that deal fell out, can you resubmit an offer? And so now I got to rewrite an offer where I was already a backup. So for a listing agent, if I'm going to have backup offers, the reason I have a backup offer is because I want to protect my client, right? So I accept an offer from Abel, and we're going through escrow, and then Alba sends me an offer, and I tell Alba, yeah, I'd love to have a backup offer. The way most listing agents go now is they just say, oh, hey, I'm going to keep it as a backup offer. If this one falls out, then I'll let you know. What I should do is counter that backup offer the same way I would have if it was in the first round of submissions. get all the terms agreed upon, including that there's going to be a backup offer addendum included, and then add the backup offer addendum. Now, the reason I do that is because once I've done that, we've agreed on counters, we've signed this backup offer addendum. If Abel says, I'm canceling, I can open escrow tomorrow with Alba's backup offer because I've already negotiated all the terms that we're willing to accept and they're willing to accept, and we have the terms of how it works for them being a backup offer. Instead of having to renegotiate or calling Alba, maybe if I just did it the simple way, which is, hey, do you want to be a backup offer? And then, 17 days into escrow when Abel doesn't remove his contingencies and cancels on me, and I call Alba and say, hey, are you guys still interested because you were the backup offer? And they go, oh no, we bought something else. Now, I've already communicated to my seller that I had these backup offers, but I didn't have anything in writing. And now when I go back to them and say, no, the backups that I called said they've moved on. Now, that doesn't mean that won't happen with this backup offer addendum. But at least at this point, I don't have to renegotiate, because what if Alba says, yeah, I am ready. But when I say, okay, now submit your new offer, well, the terms are a little different. I got to counter again. I got to get this. And we're negotiating all over again. We're doing that whole process over again. And if we can't make it work, now I'm back on the market. But we do it the right way. We get this backup offer addendum as part of our counter offer, right? So I get the offer from Alba, or Alba sends it with her offer. But let's say that she just submits her offer. So I do my counters of what everything's on the offer, and I include this, and this is part of counter offer number 1. And it's counter offer number 1 dated today, right? Because we're writing the counter offer. And I say that to Alba, because she's the only one we got, she's backup offer number 1. Now I could get an offer from Anita, and I could get an offer from Armando, and they could be a backup offer number 2 and 3. Right? And I can have all of these backup offers. You can have as many as you want, but you have to do the work, which means most of you aren't really going to have any backup offers because you're not going to do the counters. You're not going to do all this stuff because you've already had to counter the one that got accepted and presenting and all of those things. I just want to make sure that you guys know that this is the right way we could do it, so we could put ourselves in a position where we can, if we fall out of escrow, get our seller right back into escrow. So I got backup number 1. Okay? So this says the agreement is backup position number 1 is contingent upon written cancellation of any prior contracts and related escrows between seller and other buyers, and mutual release of the obligation to buy, sell, or exchange that property. Seller and other buyers may mutually agree to modify or amend the terms of a prior transaction, which means I'm not required to cancel the escrow I have already just because I have a backup offer. We can negotiate that one and keep it going. I'm not required to cancel just to go to yours if it's not working properly. Cancellation rights for buyer. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing at any time before seller provides buyer copies of written cancellations and releases of prior transaction signed by all parties in those contracts. So I have an agreement with Alba that we have an accepted offer, because we do have an accepted offer subject to the previous offer canceling. That's basically what this says. So at any time before I give her cancellation of my current escrow, she can send me a cancellation and say, I don't want to be your backup anymore, which would be fair to communicate that to the listing agent. Okay? For buyer or seller, if seller is unable to provide such written signed cancellations and releases to buyer by blank date. Now, if it were me, if I'm listing agent that is writing this and adding it to my counter, that date would be the contingency period of the buyer. If by the time the buyer is supposed to remove your contingencies, I haven't canceled, so whatever that date is, however long we are into escrow, whatever that date is, if buyer hasn't done that by that time, by that date, then I have as seller the right to cancel our backup offer. You as buyer have the right to cancel the backup offer. Fair. Okay? And the reason that's in there is because there is a mechanism in this where that backup offer already puts a deposit in escrow. I'm not telling you to do that, but that's in here. So there has to be some verbiage in here for what we do to make sure that that buyer gets their deposit back, if that's the case. So that's why we go to the time periods. Time periods in the agreement for investigations, contingencies, covenants, and other obligations shall begin on the day after seller provides buyer copies of signed cancellation and releases of prior transaction. So the default is you don't have to do inspections, appraisals, anything, put your deposit in, nothing, until I give you the proof that this one is canceled. Or I could check this box that says all time periods shall begin as provided in the agreement. However, if the date of close or escrow is a specific calendar date, that date shall not be extended unless agreed in writing by buyer and seller. So I could force, I don't know why you would do this, the backup offer to put their money in, do all their inspections, do all their investigations, and then still say, oh, it's canceled, here's your money back. And you've spent money on all that stuff. If this backup offer is attached to a purchase agreement or counteroffer, it expires with that other document. Otherwise, the backup offer shall be deemed revoked unless signed and delivered back to the party initiated by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by buyer. So it's saying that if it's part of the purchase agreement, it expires when the purchase agreement does. If it's part of the counteroffer, it expires when the counteroffer does. If it is a middle of the transaction where it's not attached to any of those, that they negotiate it for some reason, then it expires 3 days or 5 p.m. on the third day after it's signed by the seller. Period. End of story. So as you can see, we're spending a lot of time on the addendums. Any questions about the backup offer addendum? Any questions? No? Okay. Terrific. Hopefully that is because you guys understand it completely, not just because you're afraid to ask questions or you're ultimately so confused that you don't know what question to ask. I hope that's not any of the last two. Thank you guys for being here. Again, we're going to continue. I'm thinking that we're probably 2 weeks from being done. I'm hoping that's the case. If you guys need anything, you know where to find me. If you missed any part of this video, want to review it, it will be on YouTube later today. Remember, if you know somebody that could benefit from a YouTube channel, please share it with them. And if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe, please. I would appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble on for an hour every Thursday. And just go out there and be safe and be productive. Take care of yourselves.